Hello, everyone, and welcome to Get Ready for AIDS 2026, a webinar on how to write a conference abstract organized by the Journal of International AIDS Society. My name is Alberto Rossi, and I'm the managing editor of the Journal of International AIDS Society, and together with me is Anna. Anna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Anna Grimsrud. I am a deputy editor at the Journal of the International AIDS Society, and I'm also a colleague of Alberto's. I'm a senior technical advisor with IAS. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Anna. So during this webinar, we'll give you an overview of the good practices to write an abstract. This is more targeted for a conference abstract, AIDS 2026 in particular, but some of the principles will apply to any type of abstract. There will be time at the end of the webinar for questions. So please, whenever you have a question, you can type it in the chat and we'll try to respond to as many as possible toward the end of the webinar. And one more information, after this, there will be a survey. Once you end the session, there will be a survey, which we kindly ask you to fill as honestly as you can, because that will help us to improve on our next sessions. So just a few words about the Journal of the International AIDS Society, or JIAS. We are an online, peer-reviewed, open access journal. That means that anyone can read for free our articles. Our impact factor this year is 4.9. We are indexed in the major repositories such as PubMed. We are multidisciplinary, meaning that we cover all kinds of disciplines focused on HIV, from clinical science to social science to epidemiology, health economics, and so on. And one other goal of our journal is to provide capacity building activities such as the one that you are attending today to help young researchers to develop their skills. You can see here 4 covers of our supplements. So throughout the year, we publish supplements which are thematic issues on particular topics. So we encourage you to look at those in our webpage. All right, so the agenda for today is we're going to briefly introduce the abstract structure, and then we're going to dive deep into each section of the abstract. We're going to provide some guidelines on HIV terminology, and then we're going to review the abstract submission, review, and selection process for any conference, and then more specifically for AIDS 2026. And then, as I mentioned before, there will be a Q&A session at the end. All right, so we'll start with this quote, which is for a manuscript, but actually applies really well to an abstract as well. So the key to writing a good manuscript is to tell a story. And so the important point here to understand is that whenever you write an article or an abstract, even more so in an abstract, I would say, it's important that you don't take pieces of information together, separated from each other. It's important that you create a flow, you create a logical stories that the reader can easily follow that and be interested in what they're reading and understand easily what they're reading. So we're gonna go more in detail about the overall idea of the abstract. It's important for you to understand that this is a standalone summary of your work, and the standalone part, it's key here. Of course, an abstract will not include all the details that you can provide in an article, in a full article, but it's important that the reader, by reading the abstract only, can understand the full story. Again, the details will be in the article, but in theory, the reader should not have to go to the full article to understand what your study was about. So of course, you need to shorten the full article, and that's why it's important for you to only include the most interesting and most important parts of your work. This is how a normal abstract is structured. There's a title, there's an introduction, methods, results, and conclusion. We're gonna go in details for each one of those, so I'm not gonna spend more time on those here. But please do remember that this is the format that JIAS uses for our papers, and also the structure that the AIDS 2026 conference will follow. This could be different for other journal, other conferences. So before you sit down and start writing your abstract, please do make sure to check the conference or journal guidelines. All right, we'll try to make this session as interactive as possible, even though we are on a virtual setting. but there will be a few questions for you. These are anonymous, so please don't be shy. There's, we're here to learn. So we highly encourage you to contribute by responding to these questions. So the first one is, what is the most important part of a conference abstract in your opinion? Is it a title, the introduction, the methods, the results, or the conclusion? And now I'm going to try to launch the poll, which I might need some help from the team. There you go. Thank you, team. Can you see the questions on your screen? Yes, because I see you can respond. So I'll give you another 10, 15 seconds to think about this, and I will share the results. All right, 5. All right, I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. So let's see if you can see them. So 41% of you indicated that a title is the most important part of an abstract, and then results, introduction and methods, sort of evenly distributed, and then conclusion. So let's see why we asked you this question. Okay, let me stop sharing and move to the next slide. So we believe the title is the most important part of a conference abstract. And why? And the reason is because that's the first part that a reader sees. And that's the part that discloses the basic information about your study. So if the title is on something that I'm not interested about, it's a discipline that I don't know, I'm not interested about, it's very unlikely I will read the abstract. So that's why the title is the key part to attract the attention of the readers. And now I'm going to hand it over to Anna to tell you everything about the title.
Great. Thanks very much, Alberto. And I'm glad that many of you were able to participate in that first poll. So next slide. As Alberto mentioned, the title really is a mini advertisement in some ways for your work. It is the first thing that someone's going to read. It's usually, it's in a bigger font, it's more prominent, and it's really the way in which you're going to communicate what your research is about. However, here today, you've all joined this session because we're talking about conference abstracts or journal abstracts. So we want you to remember that that is who your audience is. Your audience is people that read research. And so you're not writing as if you're a journalist in terms of making a super interesting title. You're wanting to communicate very factually in your title. And so you can see that we want to have some bolded W words in your title. You want it to have the what, the where, the who, and the how. And in many ways, that can be quite challenging to get into so few words, but it's really important because these are this is the information that your readers want to have when they're going to decide whether or not to read further. Next slide. What we're going to do now and throughout the rest of the webinar is we're going to give you some samples and we're going to ask to see what's missing. And so we're starting with the title because this is the first part of an abstract. And we want you to think about whether or not this is a good title or maybe what is missing, all right? So our first title here is Prevalence and Risk Factors of Hypertension and Diabetes Among Persons Living with HIV in Zambia. So we can launch the poll, and based on that title, I want you to think, does it include the what, the where, the who, and the how, or what is missing? I'll read it again. Prevalence and risk factors of hypertension and diabetes among persons living with HIV in Zambia. So just about 20% of you voted. Let's give you a little bit more time. And again, thinking through what is missing from this title. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the findings with you. And you'll see that very accurately, 82% of you said that the how was missing. And obviously in this context, we're thinking about the how in terms of the study design. So we knew the what, the prevalence and risk factors of hypertension and diabetes. We knew where, this was in Zambia. And then in the purple, we can see the who, this was among people living with HIV. And if you hit next slide, you'll see that what we took out, because this is a real article we're talking about today, was the results of a national facility-based cross-sectional study. And so the authors, in our opinion, did a great job of answering all those W questions within their title. Next slide. Okay, so now we're moving to the introduction. And what's important for all of us as scientific writers to think about is that an abstract is a very, very structured piece of writing. This is not creative writing. And the whole point of this webinar is to try and give you some tips and some tools. And so when I'm reading an introduction section, there's 3 things that I want to see. And those are the words in red on your slide here. So I want to know the topic, and I want to know the issue, and I want to know the aim. And you can kind of think of your introduction as an inverse funnel. So the sentence at the top should have the broadest application, and you should be getting to more specific parts as you go through your introduction. So you've got some examples here of what a topic could be, such as differentiated service delivery in West and Central Africa. Then you've got the why, or the issue. Could be something like low condom use or low PrEP uptake among specific populations. And then the aim, and this is really almost the most important for me. I always want to see the aim at the end of my an introduction. Well, what's the point? Why did you do this work? And it could be to estimate the proportion of pregnant and breastfeeding women receiving routine care, or whatever your aim of your study is, should be your final sentence in your introduction. If you go to the next slide, we're going to give you the introduction from that article that we shared the title with. So, despite growing evidence on the rising burden of non-communicable diseases in sub-Saharan Africa, the national prevalence of hypertension, prediabetes, and diabetes among people living with HIV in Zambia is largely unknown. Now, is there something missing? We've launched the poll. Do they give you the topic? Do they give you the issue? And do they give you the aim? So I'll just give you a few minutes to vote and see what you think might be missing from this part of the introduction. Okay, we've got 38% of you. I'm going to try and get half of you to vote here. There we go. All right, ending the poll and sharing the results with all of you. You'll see that, again, you guys did really well. We've got 80% of you saying the aim is missing. So again, they started with the topic being the evidence of the burden of non-communicable diseases, the issue that we maybe don't know the prevalence among people living with HIV disease, and therefore this study, or what was missing that we took out on purpose for the purposes of this webinar, was the aim of the study, which was to determine the national prevalence of hypertension and diabetes and their risk factors among adults living with HIV in Zambia. Okay? I also just want, before we go to the next slide, for you to see just how many words are in this introduction, right? Not many. This introduction has three points, but only 2 sentences. And in general, for an abstract, that's about how much space you're going to have. You're not going to have a lot of space. And so you want to make sure that your intro is maybe just 2 or maybe 3 sentences, but sticking to just the topic, issue, and aim. Next slide. So on the methods, I'm a little bit sad here, everyone, because for me, the methods is the most important part once you've caught my attention. And I say this because you have to know and understand whether there was sound methods used before you know whether the results are worth their weight, right? So much of your words in your abstracts and much of your words in a full paper are going to be the methods. All right, what is we have in our methods section? You are having more W words, okay? So just like we spoke about with the title, you're going to go into some detail in your methods section. So you're going to talk about who was included in your study. Then you're going to talk about what you did or what you observed, what was measured, how you went about doing that, where the study took place, and when, which is obviously the time. Doesn't have to fall in the order of this table. Don't worry about that. Often we start, if I'm writing, I'll start with the when and the where because that's simplest. But the idea is that someone should be able to read your abstract and have all of these questions answered a little bit, right? And I say a little bit because of that scale on the top. We need to have some details, but we're limited by the number of words in the abstract, okay? Also for me, the methods section, if you just stay for a second, is the section that you can write as soon as your research is underway. it's the first thing you can write. You know your methods before you know your results. And so often if you're writing a paper, the methods section can be a really good place to start. The other thing that's in blue font and a little bit on its side up in the top right-hand corner there is that the methods section should be in past tense, meaning you have completed this study. This work has been done. You've measured it. It's not we are measuring, it's that we measured. And so we're going to give you some tips around what tense to use in these different sections as well. Okay, on to our example. So we conducted a cross-sectional study in 149 art clinics in 52 rural and urban districts in Zambia based on the adapted WHO stepwise approach to NCD risk factor surveillance and the Zamfia questionnaire. We used proportional to size sampling to select districts and clinics, targeting 5,775 people living with HIV. And we estimated the prevalence of hypertension and diabetes and used Poisson regression to analyze associations with sociodemographic, behavioral, and HIV-related risk factors and reported prevalence ratios. All right, so thinking again, we can launch the poll. Can you see who this research was with, how they collected the data, where the study took place, what information was collected, and when? So I see some of you already voting. That's great. And I hope that you have space to see the methods section again up on your screen as you're answering this. Okay, almost have half of you who have voted. Okay, I am going to end the poll. There we go, and share the results with you. And as you can see, the majority of you, again, were correct in identifying that the when is missing. So we knew where. It was in Zambia and rural and urban clinics. We knew how. It was a cross-sectional study and what sorts of measures were taken. We knew who the audience was or who the study participants was. It was 5,700 people living with HIV. We know what was measured, but what was missing was the when. And you can see we just sneakily took out that sentence for the purposes of this exercise. All right, we're going into the results, and I'm going to hand you back to Alberto.
Thanks a lot, Anna. All right, so down with the title, down with the intro, down with the methods. It's time now to disclose your results. All right, so what findings did your research question generate? So again, you want to include the key findings of your study. The article might have a lot more information, but in the abstract, you don't have to include all the data. You only have to include the data that are relevant to respond to your questions and those that you think are most important. Include statistical analysis that represent significance. So be very careful with the word significant unless you're able to provide a p-value or whatever associated statistical analysis to prove it, to demonstrate it. And also be careful with vague terms such as some, many, few. This is scientific writing. We need to be accurate and precise on the way you describe your results. The visual representation of your data could be helpful. Now, we need to make a note about this because journals, abstracts, normally, most of the time, do not allow for the inclusion of figures, tables, or graph. Conferences, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So again, it's very important for you that before you write your abstract, you check the guidelines for your conference of interest, and then you can decide whether you need to write the results or you can represent the results. For AIDS 2026, you will be allowed to include graph or tables or figures. So it's important, if you can include any of these, that you don't duplicate the data. So don't put them in the narrative and in a figure, because that's just a waste of space. And then you have to select which one you think is best for you to use to show your data. Do not repeat the methods. Do not discuss the results. That's for later. Don't speculate. And again, as Anna mentioned before, these are things that you have already done. So you should use the past tense. You found that. It's not that you are still finding results. Okay. So we will move to the next slide, which is, again, a poll. So I'll let you read through this, and then we're gonna put up the question for you. So we'll give you maybe, 60 seconds to read and reflect. I'll save you my voice this time. Okay, another 20 seconds maybe. Again, don't be shy. You can respond. We are at 30% people that responded. Let's try to match what you reached before, 50% of you. All right, almost there. A few more votes, please. So the questions are whether the results are being discussed, the data are not specific enough, or this is just perfect. All right, we can end the poll now. And this is a bit challenging. So 47% of you indicated that the results are being discussed, 35% of you indicated that the data are not specific enough, and 18% of you indicated that this is perfect. So hopefully in the next slide, I can convince you of what was wrong in that results section, which we have, for the purpose of this the webinar, intentionally modified. Okay, so you can see here we highlighted all the changes that we made. So for example, the text that we provided to you said we included participants, but it didn't say how many participants. So that's missing very, very important data. And then it goes on saying from several districts. Several doesn't really mean anything. This is science, so you have to specify 52 districts. About 2/3, that's kind of accurate in this situation, because 67% is close to 2/3. But again, you want to be accurate and say exactly what the number is. Same goes for almost 3/4. Doesn't really specify exactly how many. And then for the statistics, if you say that something was bigger, larger, whatever, you need to provide the statistical analysis that can support it. So in this case, the confidence interval ranges. And then I can go on, being a young adult doesn't really mean anything, indicate the age ranges that you consider in your study, and so on. So again, hopefully we convince you that, an abstract needs to include specific quantitative data if your study is in a quantitative study. All right, and then something else that we wanted to mention is about sex and gender analysis. So we support and encourage and mandate, this is understand, that the population of your study are divided by sex and gender. This is very important to us. There are differences, and there are biological differences, there are social differences. So it's important that you specify, you disaggregate your data in these groups. If, for example, your study only includes one group, you need to specify why. And, you need to also specify whether there's any effect associated with that particular population or subpopulation that you studied. We encourage you to follow the guidelines that we will briefly share in the chat, the sex and gender equity in research, and also those from the Canadian Institute of Health Research. These are very clear. They provide quick, easy to understand examples on how you should report data on gender and sex. All right, on to the next. Figures and tables. Again, please make sure you check the guidelines of the journal or conference you're attending, because some will allow, some will not allow. And then the question for you is whether using a graph or a table or a figure, it's a better way to convey your results, okay? And we're gonna give you some examples of this now, so that you can understand what we mean by this. Before we go to the examples, this is a quick recap of the guidelines for AIDS 2026. So you can include a maximum of 2 tables or graphs. So 1 table, 1 graph, 2 tables. and these do not count the word limit. So the word limit for abstracts at A726 is 350. Plus, on top of that, you can include a table, 2 tables or graph or images. Please make sure to use decent quality. Sometimes the tables or graph that are unreadable, and that's a disservice to the readers and to you as to the authors as well. So please do submit good quality when you provide your files. And as I mentioned before, most of the time, journals do not allow the inclusion of figures or graph or tables in the abstract for scientific publications. Okay, so here is an example. So you have to present this data, and you can choose whether a text or a table is better. So in this case, we strongly believe that it's much easier, quicker, and shorter to use words. So workshop participants were gender balanced and geographically representative. So this is shorter, clearer. So we don't think a table is a good solution here. Now I'm going to give you another example, and we will ask you to decide which one you think is best to convey the data. Okay, so is it on a table or is it on a graph? All right. I think we're good. We can show the results. So 72% of you indicated that in this case, it's best to represent the data in a graph. And we do agree with that because we think it's just a lot simpler visually to see this. The table made it more complicated to understand the subgroup, whereas a graph, a pie chart in this case, it's a lot better to immediately convey the results or the data. Okay, and now we are done with the results, and we're going to move into the conclusion section. So the conclusion must reflect the data presented in the abstract, and this is very important because sometimes we see we read the intro, the methods, the results, and then the conclusion speaks about something else, which maybe it's in the full article. But again, the reader hasn't read the full article yet. So there needs to be a connection, a flow, a story when you present your conclusions. So we suggest that there are 3 key parts. One is key messages from your study, what these messages imply, and then some future recommendations for research. Avoid obvious statements, avoid repetition of the results, don't overgeneralize. This is also very important. Sometimes a study is done in a particular setting, for example, I don't know, in a specific region or a specific country with a specific age group. You can't conclude by saying that, that intervention applies to anyone around the globe. Okay, so that's very important as well. Again, we're going to ask you to assess a conclusion. So I'm going to read it through. The prevalence of hypertension and diabetes mellitus among people living with HIV in Zambia was notably high. This underscores the need for immediate and robust intervention strategies to mitigate the high prevalence and hypertension of diabetes mellitus, along with their associated risk factors, particularly within this vulnerable demographic. And the question is whether you think this is a good conclusion section or not. We'll give you 15 more seconds to quickly reread it and think. All right, I'll say we stop the results now because, as you can see, this is a very close call. 51% of you indicated that, yes, this is a good conclusion section. 49% of you indicated that it's not. And that's exactly what we expected because it was a bit of a tricky question, this one. So to some extent, we think this is a really good section, and I'll explain why. Because there is a take-home message. The prevalence of hypertension and diabetes among people living with HIV in Zambia was notably high. And then there is a good implication paragraph. This underscores the need for immediate and robust intervention strategies to mitigate the high prevalence of hypertension and diabetes, along with their associated risk factors, particularly within this vulnerable demographic. So overall, this really conveys well the message of the study. What we think is missing is what should be next. And again, it's not mandatory. We understand that, abstract, it's not an endless, story. You have a word count limit. So it's possible that the authors at this point didn't have any space left. But we do think that, a little bit of future recommendation could be helpful. So I'm going to give you an example from another study. So what you're seeing now is the actual conclusion section of the article, which again, we think is good. I'm not criticizing it, but I'm going to give you now an example from another study, which we think it's even better. Of course, now we don't know what the study is about, but you can see here that there are the three key components of a good conclusion section: the take-home message, the implication, and some future recommendation. So I'm going to read just the future recommendation because they really convey well the message. Future research should explore scalable models to leverage the positive influence and potential of traditional healers to improve HIV care delivery. So you can see that, after all the study is completed, the authors sort of want to guide what the next research should focus on in order to move one step forward. Okay, so we are now at the end of the abstract structure. So I'm going to give you a quick recap. So we have seen the introduction, and that has to be composed by three main parts: the topic, the issue, and the aim. The methods that Anna very well described: the who, how, where, what, and when. The results, just the most important findings, and those that are specific to your research question. And then the conclusions, which should provide an overall take-home message, implication, and recommendation for future research. And now I'm going to hand it over to Anna again, that she will talk about language.
Great, thanks very much. So language is something that's really important, obviously, in the way that you write, but it also has a very specific importance within the HIV response. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that all of the work that we do at the JIAS in terms of our conferences and any language that we put out, we feel very strongly in the importance of person-first language and adhere to the people-first charter. You can see here this quote that says, "Language shapes beliefs and may influence behaviors. Considered use of appropriate language has the power to strengthen the global response to the AIDS epidemic." And we really want to encourage all of you to look at these resources, which also give you some background as to why we think that putting the person first is so important within the HIV response, but also in general. And that adage, putting people first, can be the easiest way to remember some of these ways of speaking if you're new to using person-first language, which essentially means you should describe and talk about the person before you talk about traits about them. So we do not label people, and we don't use things such as infected with HIV or HIV patient. We talk about them as people first. So we talk about people living with and affected by HIV, or a person living with HIV. We also think that people should have the ability to access information, access care, treatment, prevention, and so that they're clients of a health system as opposed to being patients and being passive. You can see more examples here, but again, we are trying to look at people first and also get rid of some of our older language, such as things like developing countries or describing behavior first. So things like risky sex and unprotected sex, we would encourage people to use things like condomless sex first. We also talk about risk in a particular way, where we would encourage people to instead talk about vulnerabilities. So this is like a helpful, let's call it a cheat sheet, but there is a lot of reason and behind why we feel this language is important. And so would encourage you to use these resources as you develop your work. Next on language, you heard me say it before that we're not creative writers in this context, that we're science writers. And so what that means is that we want you to be as clear and concise and use an active voice. So you can see as an example here, instead of saying a paper on dolutegravir and weight gain was published in 2024 by Dr. Smith, You could say, Dr. Smith published a paper on dolutegravir and weight gain in 2024. That active voice is also going to save you words, and it's also going to mean that you get to the point quicker. And that's going to be particularly important in the context of an abstract where you have less words. One other example at the bottom is not to use nouns when you could use a verb. So rather than saying we gave much consideration, just say we considered. And again, you can see how many words you're going to save there. And the last point on this slide is to delete the needless words. My next slide before I hand back to Alberto is to talk you through some good practices and some common mistakes. So on the green column of good practices, you are going to have to make sure you adhere to that word count. Your abstract will often be cut off if you try and go over, so make sure that you adhere to that. Think about who your audience is, right? If you're writing an abstract for a national conference, you can presume that the people in the audience know something about, for example, the HIV response in your country. Whereas potentially if you're submitting something to AIDS 2026, you might need to consider that people are coming from a global environment and from countries all around the world. And so you might need to start off a little bit more broadly. And then here it sounds obvious, but complying with the submission guidelines is your surest way to success. And that just means simply checking what we are looking for at IAS in this example, so that you can fit your science into our preferred method. In terms of common mistakes, I think this probably came across earlier when I said, often the aim of a study isn't in the introduction. And that's just too bad. We really want that last sentence of an introduction to say what you were doing and why you were doing it. Sometimes the most important results are not presented clearly. It should be very obvious what your headline finding is. And often we see that people overgeneralize or overstate the importance of their work. So it's a good reminder to be humble. I will turn back to Alberto for a few things before I walk you through some of the details for AIDS 2026 abstracts specifically.
Thank you, Anna. And this is very timely because I was actually checking the Q&A and there were already some questions about artificial intelligence. So we're gonna provide you some quick recommendations on this, which we think are now very timely and important. So just so you know, for AIDS 2026, each abstract will be checked for plagiarism using industry-best overlap detection tools. So if you're copy pasting from somewhere else, your abstract will be rejected. That's a fact, and that will happen, pretty much any journal or any conference you submit to. And then into artificial intelligence, well, we want to warn you to be extremely, extremely careful about using AI. And we'll give you a few of the, it's a longer list of, points in support of why you should not be using AI at this stage of list. Here is what we think are the most relevant. So the first one for me is that AI databases are not up to date or are restricted behind paywall, and that can lead to generational false information. I was actually checking, I was curious this morning, and I checked ChatGPT. ChatGPT database was last updated in June 2024. I think for any of you, June 2024. Okay, for any of you working in the HIV space, you'll know that the groundbreaking lenacapavir study was published in July 2024. Okay, so that means technically ChatGPT doesn't know about that study, which is a huge problem, right? Because that's a groundbreaking study. So be very careful with using artificial intelligence because they're not up to date. Some articles these days, very many actually, are behind paywall. That means ChatGPT is not going to pay the fees to see that article in order to respond to your question. So be very careful about using these databases. ChatGPT can give you a text, but doesn't provide a reference for that, which that means you could unintentionally be into the plagiarism issue. And that will lead to rejection of your abstract. There are obviously softwares that can detect AI-generated language. And again, that will lead into rejection of your abstract. So what we recommend, we know that, AI is out there, we're not saying, pretend that it doesn't exist. Our recommendation is that you can only use AI to improve the spelling, the syntax of your text. So you can write your abstract. Many of us are not first language speakers. So artificial intelligence can help you with the corrections, with improving the grammar and things like that, but not to generate any text, and of course not to generate any data. That's even worse. Okay, so hopefully I convinced you about these recommendations. Next, we're gonna now focus more into AIDS 2026. So some key information for you. The registration and abstract submission will open on 20th of November. So what is it, a week from today? We recommend that you subscribe to our newsletter. I think we'll shortly share that in the chat, so you can use that link. So that will provide all the information that you need. Here are the key days regarding the abstracts. So on 20th of November, the online abstract submission will open, and that will go until 27 January 2026. After that point, you cannot submit abstracts, you cannot modify abstracts. That's it. Unless you are submitting a late breaker abstract, that will open on April 9th, 2026, and will go for about 4 weeks until May 6th, 2026. So please make sure to remember these days if you intend to submit. And yeah, you can find all the information here. Again, we'll share the link in the chat. So we recommend this will be updated a week from today with all the guidelines and specificities for the abstract submission process. And we recommend that you follow carefully those. And with that, I'm gonna hand it over back to Anna. That's gonna tell everything about how abstracts are selected, submitted, and so on.
Yes, thanks very much, Alberto. And thanks for the questions to those of you who've put things in the Q&A. It'll be really helpful if you can keep putting things there as we get to the end of our slides. So on the next slide, this relates to directly one of the questions actually in the Q&A. So if you can go to next, Alberto. There are 2 different types of abstracts that you can submit to AIDS 2026. You can submit the more traditional option, which we have walked you through today with the background, method, results, and conclusions section. And this is really suitable for research across all disciplines. And you can also submit a second option. And this is suitable for lessons learned from programmatic or project implementation. And I think this, I'm just going to check, answers Alejandro's question. And in that, you would talk about the background, then a description, your lessons learned, and your conclusions and/or next steps. So you can already start working on your AIDS 2026 abstracts, even if the submission portal hasn't opened. Also, you'll see that on this slide, the abstracts for the conference are 350 words, which is a little bit generous. It's often less than that for a peer-reviewed paper. And in addition, you can include up to 2 tables or figures, so up to 2 inserts, and these don't count towards your word count this year. So what that means is you can have 350 words plus 1 or 2 tables or figures. So you actually have quite a lot of space to tell your great story. There's been a couple questions on qualitative research, and I would just like to say that qualitative research is also encouraged and part of what we review at AIDS 2026. And this would be suitable to submit under option 1, where you would describe your qualitative work. Next slide. So on the 20th, in a week's time when it opens, the first thing I'd encourage you to do is make your online profile. You might have one from a previous conference. You might need to reset your password. Go ahead and do that. The next phase is obviously about writing your abstract and getting sign-off from your co-authors. And then you want to make sure you hit the submit button before the 26th of January. So that's really, it's quite a straightforward process. Next slide. As part of the AIDS 2026 conference, for those of you who've been to an AIDS conference before, this is a very big conference with a very diverse amount of science that is presented. So at AIDS 2026, we encourage everything from basic and translational science through to political science, human rights, health systems, economics, behavioral and social science, clinical science, the whole thing, right? And so when you submit your abstract, we ask you to choose both a track and then a subcategory within that track. And we do that because that helps us to make sure that your abstract is reviewed by people that are appropriately qualified peers to assess the quality of your research. And so you can also start looking already at those track categories and subcategories. Next slide. There's a few questions about this. How is an abstract selected to be part of the conference? So first you need to submit it. Then it is sent for peer review. We send it to 4, 5, 6 people to get at least 3 peer reviewers. They score your abstract, and then those scores are sent to the track committees. You can look on the website already to see who are the track leads. And it's that track committee that looks at those scores and decides which the abstracts, based on the scores and based on the content, will be either orals or posters, and then you present at the conference. So I want to give you a little bit more insight into that. For AIDS 2026 on the next slide, if you do option 1, and by option 1 I mean the more traditional abstract of intro, methods, results, conclusion, the peer reviewers are asked the following 2 questions. The first on impact. Sorry, Alberto, I can see your chat. The first on impact, and the second is going to be on the quality of the science. So on impact, they're going to ask whether or not the study meaningfully contributes. And on science, they're going to be looking at the quality and the sufficiency of the details provided within your abstract. And based on those 2 criteria, they're going to give you an abstract a score of 1, which would be incomplete, through to 10, which would be exceptional. We then average those scores across the reviewers, and that becomes your abstract score. Similarly, for option 2, they look at impact and science, but they have slightly different questions. So on impact, it's, does the study meaningfully contribute as an original study or a useful confirmatory study? That's the same as the other side. But on the science, it's, is the program, project, or policy implementation of high quality and sufficiently explained? And so these are what they'll look at in option 2. And again, the abstract reviewers will give it a score of 1 through 10. When we look at data from AIDS 2024, the next slide, you can see the number of abstracts that were submitted. So in 2024, we had almost 7,000 abstracts submitted, and 2,500 of them were accepted, so 37%. And this varied by track. So you can see we had the most submissions in track C and E, and C, D, and E. And they all had about a 30%, 33%, or 1 in 3 acceptance rate, all the way up to track A, where we had far fewer submissions, but a higher acceptance rate. And we share this so that you understand how many peer reviewers we need, but also so that you understand how competitive it is to have your abstract selected for an AIDS conference. Next, and this is answering one of the other questions, the conferences, we have much less space to present oral abstracts than posters. So you can see here that roughly 6% of the submissions that were accepted were posters. So you went from, remember, it was about a third of the papers got in, and then of just that third, only 6% of that third were actually oral, and the rest were posters, either e-posters or in the poster exhibition. So it's very rare to have an oral abstract accepted, and these are reserved for the highest scoring abstracts and based on review of the track committee. Next slide. Late breakers, we obviously see a smaller number. There was 581, and 18% of those were accepted, and a higher proportion were oral abstract. And that's simply because we save some space for late breaking science. If you go to the next slide, I think we will tell you about the scholarship program. I think there was a question I just wanted to pause on that I think Alberto covered, but we were talking about normal abstracts. The period will be the 20th of November until the 20-something of January, whereas late breakers will be open from the 9th of April and close the first week of May. All right. Here you'll see one slide on the scholarship program. Just to say the scholarship application program has the same dates as the normal abstract, so this might be something you also want to consider. And you might also want to diarize the scholarship information session that is going to be held on the 27th of November, and you can find out more information about it. I would also just encourage all of you at the moment to familiarize yourself with the AIDS 2026 website. Obviously, today we were talking really about abstracts, and here's one slide on the scholarships, but there's also opportunities to present workshops and opportunities to make applications to the Global Village. And so for the person who was just asking about submission of a quilt, that wouldn't be something that would make sense for an abstract, but that might be something that you want to talk about presenting in the Global Village or as part of a workshop. And so you should look at the website to find out more details about that. I'll just say we're ready to have questions and answers. And so I'll look to Alberto first because he's hopefully been reading through the questions while I've been chatting here, and you can kick us off.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So let me move those. So I think, I don't know if that was answered while I was speaking about AI, but someone was asking whether AI can be used for editing purposes. Yes, it's strictly editing, it's fine, because that means, that the word in text corrector, does a similar job. So that's okay with that. So you write your narrative, and then AI can, correct it by doing some editing. That's it. And then somebody else was asking, what if I wrote my abstract and AI detected that there was AI generated text? Well, that's a not so uncommon, to be honest. The reason being that the commercially free or the openly available tools are not so sophisticated, and so they really mix results. You can take the same narrative and subject that to different AI detection tools, free. You'll find all kind of results. And the second problem is that AI is sort of pretending to be more and more human. So humans are becoming closer and closer to AI, or vice versa. I don't know. So that's possible. But if you wrote your abstract, we will consider it. Somebody was asking, can I submit 2 abstracts? I'm not correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's absolutely fine, right? We do see that. And then where do I declare that I used AI to check my grammar? The new platform, if we manage to have it, should include a checkbox where you specify whether you have used AI or not. So that should be in this year platform.
Yeah. So just to go back to the 2 abstracts question, thanks for that. You can submit multiple abstracts. Each just needs to be distinct. So you wouldn't present the same research in different ways. You would present multiple pieces of research is the way I want to say it, right? So you wouldn't submit an option 1 and an option 2 on the same findings. You would make that choice and go from there. So just make sure that it's distinct. You're not well, that's not a word. You wouldn't submit multiple times the same findings. And then we've got a question about criteria for the scholarship awards. I'm sure that our conference colleagues will share much more details on the information session about that. But what is important and why we wanted to bring it up today is a couple reasons. One is that if you have an abstract selected for the conference, that does help your chances of being selected for a scholarship. We are looking to support people who have research to present. And also we wanted to give you a heads up now because the scholarship application is quite detailed. We have a number of things we'd like you to share about yourself and how you're going to use the experience and disseminate your learnings when you get home. And you also submit recommendation letters for scholarships. So you may want to start talking to your colleagues and your mentors and get your scholarship application together. So stay tuned and look that up. Those are just little pieces that I know about the scholarship process.
Somebody else was asking about leaved experiences as data, so that would fall into qualitative research. Yes, that can be considered. Then, of course, the question is, whether that provides sufficient new information, scientifically sound. But, technically speaking, yes, lived experiences fall into the qualitative data, so that can be done.
I would also say there's some really good questions about some of the option 2 abstracts. And the thing that I would recommend doing is reading abstracts from the previous conference. So the abstracts are freely available and they're published in a special issue of the Journal of the International AIDS Society. And there you will be able to see what the selected abstracts were. And so that'll give you a great idea of kind of the format that they use and what was successful for those people in their submissions. So often you'll hear people say, the best way to improve your writing is to do more reading. And so if you're trying to understand the best abstracts and how to write them, it's definitely worth reading some of them.
Yeah, and then somebody else was asking whether a comparative study conducted with secondary data can be selected. We don't exclude any science by default. The question again is whether that secondary data analysis provides sufficient new information to be interesting for the scientific community. But so by default, as long as your study is sound, scientifically sound, yes, you are allowed to submit data. And then, as Anna showed, the selection process is quite competitive. 7,000 abstracts submitted, so that's quite competitive. But yeah, of course, you should. We encourage you to try.
Great. I'm going to answer the last question that's just been typed here, and we may then need to wrap up. So the question is there a time period of the research studies done? There's not an explicit time period, or we would have included it in our slides. But we want recent research, right? So I think that if things are 3 or 4 or 5 years old, it's going to be less likely that they're going to necessarily still be relevant, and then they are not going to score very highly on their applicability. However, we also realize that it takes time to collect data. It takes time to analyze data, and it takes time to write it up. And so you do need to, in order to submit an abstract, the work needs to be done. It can't be in progress, right? And so we would be expecting it to be data that had been collected in the last few years. I'm going to use an intentionally vague word. But if it's primary research, obviously, you can also submit abstracts that are reviews, and then that would obviously include potentially a longer time horizon.
Yeah, I'm going to add a bit to that because we see this very frequently in the full articles that are submitted to the Journal of the International AIDS Society about a time frame. The reason why we don't specify a specific date is because for certain studies, 2 years could be old. For other studies, maybe 5 years old is the most recent data that we actually have. And so we would be more open, to consider that if that's really like the most recent piece of data that is available to the scientific community. So there is no clear cut, but if you have data that are on the older side, you need to make a case as to why this is still relevant. And I think with that, in the interest of time, we'll sort of close the session. So we want to thank you all for attending this. Thank you so much. We will, as I mentioned at the beginning, we will share a link for a survey that we kindly ask you to fill so that our next webinars can be more interesting, more engaging, more relevant to the questions that you have. Again, thank you so much, and we hope to see you in Rio de Janeiro at the conference next year.
Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye.